Hi, everyone. Happy API month, emphasis on the PI. And thank you for closing the doors. Thank you for that. All right, thank you for attending this panel. Welcome. We're going to be talking about the ways folks here on this panel are tackling the climate crisis. First off, my name is Rachel Ramirez, and I cover all things climate change over at CNN. I'm Filipina. I'm based in New York City, but I was born and raised actually in a Pacific island, specifically the island of Saipan, north of Guam. It's in the Northern Marianas Islands. It's a U.S. territory. So as you know, heat waves like the one that just occurred this past weekend, wildfires and droughts, will happen more often now, scientists say, and hurricanes and tornadoes and all that will only intensify unless we slash our emissions ambitiously and aggressively. So I actually want to pass it on to the panelists here to briefly introduce themselves, how they're tied to the AAPI community, and what they're doing to ensure that we still have a livable and safe planet. I guess I'll start here. Go over. No pressure, Angela.
Suggestion.
Hi.
Since you asked.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Manso. I'm the National Outreach Director at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. My connection to the API community, while not direct, of course, is through my friends and my professional colleagues who, over the years, have educated me or attempted to educate me tremendously about the API Native Hawaiian community. I'm sorry, there's another acronym in there that I probably missed. But certainly, our organization being led by none other than Manish Bhatna, who came to us from the World Resources Institute and has been quite a visionary in his few months at the organization, ensuring that we are at the forefront of this movement in addressing, of course, climate change, but also equity in this work as well. So very glad to be here, and I will pass it on.
Thank you all so much for having me. Senator Kesha Hinsdale from Vermont, and often people say, wow, we have an AAPI legislator in Vermont. We do. I served for 10 years, in fact, and I was vice chair of the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, served on our local Resources Defense Council, Oxfam Climate Change Ambassador. I grew up originally in my Indian immigrant father and Jewish American mother's Irish pub in Los Angeles, a very common American story. And I really think what I've tried to impress most of all is that the AAPI community, or the APIDA community, actually I feel like the rest of the AAPI community made sure Daisies were included too, which is nice. The APIDA community has been at the forefront of the environmental movement for centuries. Indian women were chaining themselves to trees when others were trying to take away our natural resources. And in a lot of these, in a lot of climate emergencies and changing climate, our communities are the ones that are on the front lines with typhoons and hurricanes and heat waves like the one in India that is getting up to 140 degrees. So, when we hit those temperatures that are actually unlivable, where people die in their sleep, Asian Americans know what that's like firsthand and have a lot to teach the rest of the world before it's too late. So that's been my message, and I'm happy to have that discussion with all of you today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Cairum, Director of Global Public Policy at Walmart, where I handle environmental policy for our company. I'm a second-generation Indian American, born and raised in New York. I'm also married to a Filipina American, so we have a Filipina Indian child. She's got all the great traits of both ethnicities. Walmart is very committed to advancing and being an employer of choice for the AAPI community. Our Chief Technology Officer is of Indian descent, and just some recent stats that we had, over 12% of our management professionals are of AAPI descent in North America, and from associate to management promotions, and so really a reflection of growth and retention in the company are AAPI members. And so I'm really excited to sort of this conversation to understand how we can hear and learn for what Walmart can do more for the AAPI community on climate and environmental issues, especially on equity and access issues. We have a history of working with the advocacy community, whether it's APAICS, as well as recently addressing anti-Asian violence with funding for TAF and the Center for Asian Pacific Women Leadership. And so more for us to do, and we're here to listen and understand where we can lean in and support our communities across our global supply chain.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Oliver Campbell. I'm a director as well as distinguished engineer in supply chain, and I lead the packaging team at Dell Technologies. My relationship with AAPI is really through two deep relationships. First, my family, we had lived in the Philippines during two sabbatical tours my father had with the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, the Philippines. Rice, as many of you know, is a staple food in Asia, and nearly all of the rice consumed in Asia stems from work at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. And so in traveling with my father, I really became exposed to what marginal and vulnerable communities, particularly in rural areas, are like, and how they're so dependent upon weather, extreme weather. So much of this work has been going on for some time, but it's becoming more and more important. My second deep relationship is my wife, Midori, is of Japanese descent. So like many Americans, we're a mixed family. So I think we're a typical American story in that way. For Dell, when we look at climate change, we have, I think, really important work going on in four main areas. And it really stems from Michael Dell's original vision to use technology for the benefit of people and the planet. It's really that simple. And on the planet side, we have key initiatives in sustainability and a circular economy. I'll give you an example. Our goal for 2030 is to have 100% of our packaging made from recyclable or renewable material. I'm in charge of that goal. And we're about 90% of the way there. We also have a goal for take back. So for every product we make, we will take back and put into the circular economy the same or similar product. So if we sell a monitor, we're going to take back a monitor. Sell a desktop, take back a desktop. And we also have other goals around net zero, which I think we're going to talk about later. We have a goal for our scope to be net zero on scope 1, 2, and 3 by 2040. And we also have a goal for around scope 1 and 2 for a 50% reduction by 2030. So we're very aggressive there. And two others very quickly, if I may. It's not only the atmosphere, but it's the oceans. Dell is a co-founder, and I was very involved in this work in co-founding Next Wave Ocean Plastics, which is a consortium of like-minded companies, Dell, HP, IKEA, Shinola, Herman Miller, Trek Bicycle, and others to take ocean-bound plastic out of the ocean and put it into the circular economy. And then finally, we do have initiatives like Project Luna, which are oriented around how do we rethink our entire product design in terms of repairability, reusability, long life, and oh, by the way, cut emissions by over 50% in doing so. So these are some of the things that were going on at Dell. We're very excited to be here and to listen to the conversation and see how we can help. Thank you.
Talafalava. Hi, everyone. My name is Wulf-Saena, and it's an honor to be here, especially be among Senator and also the experts up here. I'm originally from Samoa, so that's my connection to this Asia Pacific. Sorry. I moved to the United States in 2005. Before moving here, all my working life as a public servant back home, I was working on climate change. Working on climate change from that side, advocating for the world to reduce greenhouse gas emission, to stop climate change because islands were sinking. A lot of my work focuses on the human impact, the impacts to people's lives and also people's livelihoods. We can talk about, how sea level is rising. We hear about heat waves, but the work that I do really goes in like, how does that affect families? How does that affect people's livelihoods and what makes them vulnerable? So a lot of the work before I moved to the United States really worked with communities, engaging communities to build their capacity to respond to climate change. As you can also see many times, sorry, I've got this thing in my throat. Many times, planning for climate change really is a top-down approach. You get the policies established, and then they passed on, and then they develop programs. And then at the front lines where it really matters, those resources are not trickling down. So now I live in California. I founded an organization called Climate Resilient Communities, and we're doing the same work there. We're building community capacity. It's all about capacity building for community leaders, for other community-based organizations, so that they can be at the front line, or they can be at the front or at the table advocating and getting resources for their communities. In California, there are a lot of resources, and again, we cannot reach those resources because a lot of those funding coming from the federal government, coming from the governor's office, stays with bigger organizations that have or can afford consultants or have bigger staff members to help them write proposals for their programs. But for small organizations like Climate Resilient Communities who directly work with households, it's very hard for us to get those funding. And what we are trying to do at that space is not only building the capacity to access those funding, but also identifying priorities for those funds. So I'm very happy to be here, to be able to share more about our programs and also to hear from our other panels here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Violet, and everyone. And to what Violet was saying, you can see sort of the parallels between climate and sort of COVID in terms of resources and COVID kind of exacerbating, the impacts and just the historical legacies of injustice that's kind of within communities. But I want to start, this round of questioning, and hopefully we have time for Q&A with the gentleman in the room. The UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released 3 critical climate reports in the last year. It's the Working Group 1, 2, and 3, and there's different there's the physical science part, the adaptation and impacts, and then it went through what we can do, sort of the solutions part. So it details how we're sort of projected to move past that critical 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And for those who don't know, that's sort of the key level that scientists say we can't pass, or else irreversible impacts will occur. And right now we're at about 1.1. And we're already seeing sort of these destructive wildfires, this deadly hurricanes and all that. And because of that, we need to make bold and ambitious goals. And a big part of that is looking at, corporations like Walmart and Dell to really slash emissions. So maybe I'll start with you, Jay, and then go to Oliver. How has that journey to net zero been? And what are the ways you engage with communities to let them know that, it's not all talk and that you're actually proactively implementing action?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And it's a point of pride for us because net zero is critically important, and we want the economy to get to net zero. But as a company, Walmart's actually committed to zero emissions by 2040 without the use of offsets. So our ambition is really it's aspirational, but we also believe we have a strong business roadmap to get there. Walmart's commitment to sustainability is longstanding. It's been in place for the last 16 plus years, and we've continued to accelerate that. The zero emissions commitment was instituted in 2020, and it reflects a shift in thinking from us as a business, in that it's beyond sustainability. We're talking about becoming a regenerative company, so a company that wants to restore, renew, replenish, and conserve natural resources, because we've got a lot to catch up on. In terms of our commitment itself, one of the realities about being in the retail sector is 95% of our emissions are in the supply chain. So it's called Scope 3 emissions. So that is not directly under our control. It's all the products and the things that we sell and the embedded carbon and GHGs within those products. That isn't to say that we're not working to address that. Our commitment is what's called science-based, so it is aligned with the Paris Climate Accord's goal to get to 1.5 degrees, and it is something that we report on through voluntary disclosure through groups like CDP and SBTI on an annual basis. So we want to be transparent. We want to make sure that our customers, our investors, the policymakers that we work with are very well aware of our annual plan and how we're getting there to reduce emissions. A little bit more on our actual commitment. So if you think about Walmart, it's stores and trucks, to break it down, right? It's 5,000 stores, 200 plus distribution centers, another set of fulfillment centers, and then 10,000 vehicles on the road. So we're trying to zero emissions across that entire operational system. So that means we have to switch to low global warming potential refrigerant systems, go to zero emissions transportation, which is the biggest challenge. Most of our vehicles are Class 8 trucks. We don't have the technology at scale to get there. We don't have the charging infrastructure in place to get there. But we've committed to it, and we're working on innovation with a variety of OEMs and manufacturers, testing out new tools in hydrogen fuels, battery technology on site and across some of our core routes to see how we can find those best pathways to scale. And then the last piece is on renewables, and we've committed to sourcing 100% renewable energy by 2035 to power our stores. Again, the pandemic exposed some serious concerns about supply chains and the availability to build the needed renewable power in the timeframes we need. So we're working now to really address those pipeline challenges, think about new ways of deploying clean energy on site, and accelerate that. And we need some policy changes to get there. In terms of thinking about how we engage our community, we have a lot of communities which we have to engage with. We have our consumers, obviously, and we have our shareholders, and then we have our supplier community. And this goes back to that Scope 3 point I was making. We have something called Project Gigaton, which is our commitment to avoid 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases by 2030 through work, capacity building, technical assistance, bringing new tools to our entire global supply chain. One of those tools that we're bringing is called the Gigaton PPA, which is a platform we've developed with Siemens to allow for small or medium enterprises in our supply chain to source renewable power. A lot of those firms don't have the technical capacity to have a whole renewable procurement team. We're trying to address that market challenge. We're also working with HSBC to create sustainable finance pathways for businesses that are willing to set aggressive science-based targets for their own operations. So for us, it's that consumer base, that sort of community that in the supply chain. If we can really accelerate that transition, we're going to be doing our part to get to that climate reduction. The last thing I'd mention is moving the sector. the retail sector, I mentioned 95% of our emissions is in the scope 3. It's up the supply chain. That's common for the retail community. So we need to move this sector along as well. Employ millions of people, millions of Americans. It's a chance to socialize the need to do climate action, but it's also a chance to sort of move the economy toward climate action itself. And a couple ways that we're doing that. We're the champions at the global level of something called the Race to Zero Challenge, which is a push to get more and more retailers to embrace science-based targets, as well as their trade associations to motivate the trade associations to articulate how a retailer can get to net zero. And we're doing that work with the National Retail Federation. And then via policy. So when our CEO was chair of the Business Roundtable, we were the first major business community to endorse a market-based mechanism to address climate at the national level, including a price on carbon. So we're trying to leverage all our different communities, whether it's consumers, suppliers, business partners, other innovators who want to close the gap on emissions, and then finally policy and our industry peers. So that's a little bit of how we're trying to get there.
Thank you. Over.
Yeah, at Dell, when we talk about a journey to net zero, when I think about it, it's really many journeys. There's many pathways to this. And I think we at Dell have been doing this, before it really was a thing, when we were optimizing our logistics networks for the fewest miles traveled. We continue to make our boxes smaller and smaller for efficiency. How do we eliminate plastics in like our packaging? We've made tremendous progress there. And that type of thinking and drive and cultural change really starts to impact itself into as we start to think about our net zero goals. As I mentioned in the introduction, we have a goal of net zero by 2040. And I guess similar to Walmart, our belief is we should really try and shrink our carbon footprint as much as possible before offsets are used, because otherwise, what's the point? Is kind of how we think about it. And I think that idea is gaining more and more traction in the world, and it's good to see. Our near-term goals are scope 1 and 2, 50% reduction by 2030. So we're focusing the organization, we're focusing our front end of the supply chain, our suppliers and what we use, those types of communities, for aggressive reduction over the next several years. We also look at our electricity usage. We want 75% of our electricity to be from sustainable sources by 2030 and 100% by 2040. So again, you're seeing this drive, and it takes some time to reorient these supply chains. I think as Jay mentioned, there's a lot of innovation involved. We're changing paradigms that have been decades in the making, and because they've been decades in the making, there's a ton of infrastructure that needs to be reoriented. And so how you manage to run the business, change that, and deliver great products all at the same time has to be kept in balance. And I think that's why it's really important we get started now, not later. And when we talk about communities, we obviously have our supplier communities. I would say they're on board with what we're trying to do. Many of them are big corporations. They get it. Our own infrastructure, we get it. And then our customers, this is really interesting in the conversations we have with our customers. It's like, how can we help them become more sustainable, reach their own net zero goals? So there is this cascading effect throughout industry where you're seeing, I think, a large-scale conversion. Of particular note is what we're doing with really vulnerable communities. We have a project called Solar Labs. It's actually, imagine a big shipping container stuffed with computers with big solar panels on top. And we have a number of these already in Africa, and I think 2 here in the Americas. We're in 6 countries, and we're expanding in through Asia. Our goal is to have 100 of these in place by 2030. And this is really to give access to children who do not have, one, electricity in their villages. Now they can have it, it's powered by the sun, but they can start to be plugged into the global economy and start to have opportunities they didn't have before. So I think this is something in terms of engagement that is very, very positive, and it's changing lives, one person at a time in positive ways. So those are some of the things that we're doing at Dell, and we'd be happy to come back and report on our journey next year, see how we're
I'll
doing.
do an audit story. Let's check in. But yeah, Senator, I want to turn to you. You authored your first bill on environmental justice as a college senior, right? And this was back when EJ, environmental justice, was barely a huge part of the climate conversation. And I'm curious, throughout your career, can you talk about how have you and do you continue to hold industries, especially fossil fuel companies that continue to pump planet warming emissions into the air and in our water? How do you hold them accountable?
Well, it's funny to listen to, companies and corporations doing pretty good work and knowing government is on its own journey, and we are often better at telling other people what to do than we are doing the thing ourselves. So, I just want to be fair and conscious around that. But, so often if it's something like minimum wage or, offering people good health care or being a good climate leader, you're trying to level the playing field, because otherwise someone can game that map and take advantage of lower costs or lower inputs. And so really our job is to watch that and pay attention and make sure people are generally acting in good faith. But if you're dealing with huge systems, we were talking about, sometimes you can create new problems. When you were trying to solve old problems, you can ban plastic bags and learn that reusable bags still have an impact, and are you taking care of all of those things at the same time? But stepping back, trying to speak for all of government in this context, I think there are some really critical things to keep in mind. We have to have some principles around how we do this work, and it was really great to hear Oliver mention some of this, but you can't have huge winners and losers, and you can't leave whole populations behind in this conversation. And I actually got my start in Los Angeles working for the Coalition for Clean Air, and we were working on getting perchloroethylene out of dry cleaning. Many folks may or may not know that dry cleaning is, a huge carcinogen. It affects the workers first and stays in the groundwater. And I see a lot of nodding heads. Most people are like, what did you just say? But part of my job in high school was to start reaching out into the Korean community and make sure people had resources and materials and connection to what we were doing. And why? Because Korean immigrants own 2/3 of the dry cleaning establishments in LA. And so that was my first look at, we could pass a law and feel really good about ourselves, but we could be putting under, a whole generation of families who just got a foothold in the economy who are now suffering and now hate environmentalists. So, it was my first lesson in justice has to be at the core, or you will make choices for people that they don't have the agency to make themselves, and that is when we get that separation between economy and environment. And so, I started to look at what that looked like in a place like Vermont, a very rural state. We are one of the last states in the country that doesn't have an environmental justice policy on the books. I really hope the governor signs my bill this week. It took me 16 years to pass it because, we were a state that thought we're pretty green, and we don't have a lot of industry, so who are we regulating here? And it is really important. I mean, you heard about understanding your supply chain. You should understand the problem that you're trying to solve. Who are the communities left behind? Where are the emissions coming from? In a place like Vermont, the emissions are coming from home heating and transportation, which is really common for what government tries to influence in terms of complex, large systems. And when you look at a rural state, or really almost any state, when you look at home heating and transportation, it is going to be low-income rural people who are most impacted. If you say, a gas tax will solve this problem, well, who has to drive 75 miles to get to work? What if they can't drive to get to the grocery store or a doctor's appointment, and you've now made that expense greater? If they don't see an electric vehicle charging station in their community, or they don't get a power wall, then you can bet this is technology that will be foreign to them for far longer than it is for other folks. Home heating. If you're talking to people who say, I have mold in my basement and I'm heating my house with a space heater and my stove, Well, they have bigger fish to fry than, put a solar panel on their roof and solve their problems. So you really have to work with those communities. The thing that I learned when I was at college is that the communities that were most impacted and most left behind were mobile home communities. And they're so forgotten in this conversation. But in rural states, mobile home communities make up a large chunk of where people can afford housing and feel like they own something. So in our state, about 8% of the state live in mobile homes. They were 40% of those affected by Tropical Storm Irene, which you may remember was one of the big storms that impacted the Northeast. So our big storm, almost half of the people who were impacted had their homes destroyed and washed away because they live in mobile homes. So there was no going in with, with mops and sandbags and helping them. They really, really felt left behind, and 10 years later, they're still feeling the impact of that. So when we talk about our new innovative solutions, we need to build trust first, and that's what I spent a lot of my time and effort doing, and that's why environmental justice finally has come full circle to being at the core of so much of what we're doing. And I just was doing a panel at our military school, and I'll say this and then I'll turn it back over. But it took me a long time. Now people nod and they get it, but it took me a long time to say, if you wait until those who are comfortable are affected by climate change, it will be too late. Because we know where sea levels are rising, we know whose crops are affected, we know who's left behind, who's already feeling the impacts, who's going to die in heat events this year in the United States even, who's dying in fires. And if we wait until those who are mobile and have the resources to leave and make other plans are impacted, the ones who have ACs, we will be looking at an irreversible disaster. So it is in all of our best interest to start with those who are most impacted and make sure that we reverse the effects now.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, proactive action instead of reactive. Building off of that, Angela, President Biden ran on a platform that really put a spotlight on climate change and environmental justice. And while there have been some wins, like we now have a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, I'm not going to list all of them, his signature Build Back Better plan, which included critical climate provisions, has basically died down. Can you talk about the urgency, to get Congress to pass at least some climate legislation? We're in a midterm election cycle, and we're also running up to another UN climate conference, COP27, where again, we have to put something on the table. Can you talk about what's at stake here and just that urgency in general?
Sure. We were very pleased with the proposal that President Biden announced last year, Build Back Better. A lot of very important provisions in there regarding climate and environment. We're very excited and certainly working to ensure that the legislation that the House and Senate could put together would pass and get signed. The House did its work. The Senate is where bills go to die, I am told. But not your Senate, right? Exactly. The U.S. Senate is where bills go to die. And, certainly a frustration that this isn't done yet, but certainly not letting up on ensuring that Congress understands the urgency of this matter. As you said, the president ran on this platform. A number of commitments were made at COP26, and we need to step up. We as a country need to step up and regain that leadership role that we once held in this space. And, my hope is that we can get a reconciliation bill that has some very strong climate provisions in there. We know there's been legislation that's passed. It has some items in there that address equity, infrastructure and the like. One of my favorites, of course, is some funding, not sufficiently, unfortunately, but some funding to begin replacing lead service lines, which, go to any community in this country. And you can guarantee that over half of those households are being served by service lines that still contain lead in them. We have the capacity to do this, create jobs in the process, and get this done. So, coming up to the midterms, I would hope that the Congress would understand that they need to show the public what they've done, that they are addressing this problem in a very active way, proactive, not reactive way. So, because it's a referendum, right? The midterms are always a referendum on the party that's in the White House, the party that's in charge of either chamber. So my hope is that they see that I don't know when we will get an opportunity to do this at this scale again. As was said, there is a point of no return here, and if we are not doing everything we can in terms of investments and other resources to mitigate this problem, I fear for what we have left. We're going to be spending even more dollars on the other side of this. What was it? I think about 18 natural disaster events occurred in 2021. You estimate about $1 billion+ per event. You're looking at very real money that we're having to put to mitigate for these events. So that compounded with all the other challenges as a society that we're facing, and also in communities of color, low-income communities, frontline, we are really setting ourselves up for much more challenges than I think we're prepared to admit. So the urgency is now. There's a lot at stake. There's a window of opportunity. It's making sure that we create the will for it to get done.
And that window is closing rapidly, unfortunately.
We press on.
Right. Now, I guess I want to go to, the actual communities that are impacted. And Violet, I have to say, when Butch told me that there's a Pacific Islander in this panel, I was really happy. Pacific Islanders are a growing population in the U.S. and, it's AAPI month, but yet, and when you look at a lot of news articles, stories, and just, just the makeup of a lot of events, and I really appreciate APAICS putting in the effort and putting an emphasis on PI, but usually the PI part gets overshadowed. So I'm really glad that you're here today with us, especially talking about climate change, because Pacific Islanders are in the front lines of the climate crisis. I want to talk about your organization, which I believe helps low-income and marginalized communities gain access to resources such as solar panels, home energy audits, and whatnot. What are you seeing on the ground or hearing on the ground, some of the barriers and concerns from the communities that you work with? Kind of set the scene for us on what are the concerns that you're hearing.
So we started our organization. That was one of the first projects right after Duke. There was a project, I learned that there were a lot of resources available to low-income families, especially in California. There's a cap-and-trade fund. So a certain percentage of the cap-and-trade fund goes into disadvantaged communities. And a lot of funding is to provide low-income families with free solar panels. Unfortunately, at the time, when I was researching that whole project, it's called the HASH program or the MASH. The funding is there, the program is there, but it was very hard for low-income families to access it because of not only the eligibility, there are a lot of criterias and the application itself. And so, it's a long application, and most of the head of the households are, first-generation immigrants. Most of the head of households don't speak English that well. Some don't read that well as well. So to fill in that gap, I started to work in these communities in East Palo Alto. Started in East Palo Alto, help families, homeowners to access the program. But what we found out is that, when we were doing energy audits, most of the homes don't qualify because even the program itself, you have to have a qualified roof, right? A 10-year roof, a 10-year life left. Most of the roofs were old, and so the family automatically disqualified because you need to put a new, maybe $10,000, $12,000 roof so that you can access the program. So I learned how these programs that were developed had all these criteria that prohibits the families that the programs were developed for. So we became an advocate And then the program grew. So what we did is from solar panel partnering with Grid Alternatives, another nonprofit organization in the Bay Area that actually put solars on the roof. I started reaching out to Habitat for Humanity and then Rebuilding Together. And then the Resilient Home Program, which is one of our programs, have all these different partners that comes on board to fill in some of these gaps. So we have, for example, a family who received home repairs from Habitat for Humanity, and then a new roof, and then Grid Alternatives will come and put the solar panel there. So it grew that way. But what we have found and what we have learned from the communities is that many of these low-income families, and even Pacific Islanders, where we work, it's a large percentage of Pacific Islanders living in East Palo Alto compared to the whole United States, except for Hawaii. Many of the Pacific Island families, mostly Tongans and Samoans, because, culturally, we don't believe in free stuff. So, we had to get over that conception as well. So there was a lot of awareness building, and we spent a lot of time talking to the community. And most of the time, they don't believe you at first because, what's, with the government, what's behind it, right?
Yeah.
Or even worse is when we started our programs, PG&E and all these other programs, people trying to sell solar panels have already been to their doors, and there's a lot of mistrust. So talking about trust, so we had to build trust all over again with this programming. And the way we did is that we worked with families closely. We became case managers, and so we got involved from the beginning to the end of the project. We brought in all the different partners to build that trust. And once those families got their solar panels installed, new windows, even furnaces, we find that many times in these homes, there's a lot more you're bargaining for. I mean, you go in just to put solar, you ended up putting all new windows in the home. So that's the reality, right? When we're talking about, implementing programs in these communities, there's a lot more, even with climate change and adaptation. You talk about mitigation. So, for example, electric vehicles. It's a big thing in California, a lot of Teslas, a lot of programs there. But when you talk about EV in a community of color, they tell Violet, you're crazy, we can't afford Tesla. It's something that's so out of reach. But when you look at what's going on with those existing programs, yes, you can actually lease an EV cheaper than paying for a cell phone bill because of all those existing programs there in California. Unfortunately, if you're living in a community like East Palo Alto, you can transition. Most families live in apartments. There are no charging stations. You don't get an outlet to charge an EV. So in the end, all those things stops you from moving forward, from accessing that new technology. So going back to your question, the conversation is always back to the baseline, where the communities are. We have to meet the communities where they are. And most of the time, it's all about education. It's all about building awareness. It's all about providing resources. But the most important thing is gaining that trust from the community, and you coming in there that they are the focus. We don't go in, okay, here's my new EV program, you can do the, no. It's really like what is important. And for us, we have been successful because we work through leaders that have already built the trust in the community. And through that partnership, and it's all about partnerships too, throughout the whole process. CRC is not, we do a lot of coordination, convening, but the success of the whole program is all the partners that are involved.
All right, thank you for that, Violet. And I guess, Senator, I want to turn to you just to follow up on what Violet said. You mentioned how rural communities, tend to be also overlooked in a lot of these climate conversations. And I'm actually writing a story right now on what's going on with rural communities in California in terms of the water crisis and the drought going on right now. how are rural communities, if you could just kind of elaborate and build on what you mentioned earlier, how are rural communities being affected by climate change and policies and, or the lack thereof? And how should, I guess, we as, policymakers, journalists, in terms of coverage, advocates kind of address that?
Well, I was just so appreciating what Violet said, because often our disparities are harder to see in rural areas, but they exist. I live in the whitest state in the country, and still, when you look at home ownership, it's one of the largest disparities between Black and white homeowners in the country. And home ownership has been key to participating in any of these programs. Do you own this home, and then is it infrastructurally sound? So, I'll just start by saying we often learn from urban areas, but urban areas can learn from rural areas too. And so I thought I'd mention something. I think when we talk about such big issues, it's helpful if we can see the issue and we can change people's mindsets with, systems change projects. And I say that because I was working with, I was like a vegan at the time, so let's just start there. Like I was this vegan who grew up in California, and I started in the legislature, but people thought, she's a real problem solver. And so a woman who had done work in Madagascar, on international rural development, like we often forget US rural development, she came to me and she said, we have a lot of immigrants and refugees who want goat meat. And it was being shipped across the globe from Australia, a lot of carbon emissions there, freezing process, lower quality goat meat. Well, Vermont has a lot of goat dairy. And when, male goats are born, they're kind of unproductive in goat dairy. And so they're often just killed, and that's made waste. And so she's like, stay with me here, because we should have, male goats who are available for slaughter in culturally appropriate ways and ceremonial ways with immigrants and refugees. We're trying to get local goat meat, but it has to meet the same price point as it would in Australia, and I need your help to get all these regulations out of the way. And I was like, wow, I am a vegan sitting here thinking, okay, I never thought this would be my job. But, we created a refugee-led goat farm. It's run by Bhutanese immigrants, and people come and visit and learn a lot. And frankly, there was a good period of time, I forget what happened, it was the greatest thing, but the goats would eat all of the, the poison ivy and stuff in the communities too. So they were like, everyone's favorite Parks and Rec employees were the goats. So it was this very visible way that we were saying, we are stopping, goat meat from coming from abroad. We're creating local access, which, gives immigrants and refugees a place of empowerment to say, we live close to the land too. It's not like we're coming, there's often this idea of like this white farmer in the field, and like that's how agriculture works. We have migrant farm workers, we have brought up Black people who understand living off the land and producing from the land and dairy farming better than white Vermonters, and yet we're given this sort of like rural mantle as a white state that like you're just the romantic farmers. But this opportunity it was such a sea change for people to just see like, wow, that's how we're going to solve climate change, is like listening to people who have original instruction and greater experience as environmentalists, and creating, problem-solving mechanisms, getting regulation out of the way that allows us to have a system that works and is local, and we can see when other larger supply chains break down. So I just wanted to share that because it was like this great Asian American success story of like what happens when we think of rural development as something we can do here and empower the people who know the most, who are often otherwise treated as, those who need the most help.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that, Senator. And we started late, so I'm just going to keep going until we reach the hour and maybe open it up to questions if anyone has one. But I'm going to ask a couple more questions to our panelists here, and I actually been wanting to ask this question. Oliver mentioned packaging and the work that Dell has been doing, and I want to bring in Jay as well. And this is probably something that many of us in this room has experienced. So I made a huge Walmart order, to stock up on some apartment stuff like detergent, shampoo, and stuff. But it came in a bunch of different boxes. It came separately in different days. And so, as a climate reporter, that has me wondering, that's a lot of emissions. Can can't we just put it all in one box? So I'm just curious, what's Walmart doing to address that? And Jay, you can answer that, and Oliver, feel free to hop in as well.
Well, first, thank you for your business. It's a great question and something that we are very keenly working on. We're well aware of, just the shifts in e-commerce and consumer behavior that we need to address packaging, and we need to address packaging waste. As a business, we think about this from an upstream and downstream perspective. Senator was talking about systems level change, and it's resonant with us too, because of where we sit on that global supply chain and our engagement with consumers, and then the collection aspects of dealing with packaging waste. So let me just say quickly what our commitments are. We are committed to becoming a zero waste business, which means all the waste that comes out of our stores will be deferred from landfill by 2025. We're about 80% there. That last 20% is the hardest 20%. We are also committed to being 100% recyclable, reusable, and industrial compostable on our plastic packaging by 2025, and to reduce virgin plastic content in our packaging by 15% by 2025. These are all important targets for us. It's our North Star and allows us to do that innovation. And I think some of the areas that we're doing it, again, are leveraging our footprint and working with our frankly, our competitors and our colleagues in the space. So leveraging our footprint, we have 5,000 stores. It's a place where we want to drive traffic to the stores. And then when we do that, we can get rid of the packaging. We can have online grocery pickup. We take the groceries that you order on our app, put it directly into your trunk. It's a solution that is working in Senator Hinsdale's state in Vermont, and it's a solution we want to bring to other states. Secondly, on issues related to plastic bags, we are looking with Target, CVS, Walgreens as part of the Beyond the Bag Coalition. We want to find innovative ways for consumers to have more access to reusable bags when they come to the store, as well as to have less environmentally impactful alternative materials. So using seaweed and different kinds of really cutting edge alternative materials that don't have the carbon impact of both plastic and paper, which some folks don't realize is upstream. The production of paper is just as, if not more harmful than plastic. So we're doing work in that space. And then directly to your point on the packaging side, we're making investments to do more consolidation. A lot of that is contingent on data and information, understanding the consumers, how we manage our operational logistics. But we're reducing packaging, reducing the packaging fill, getting rid of EPS or styrofoam, but also just shrinking the packaging more tighter to the actual product. So that's some of the ways in which we're working there. And then lastly, going back to my earlier points on working with the suppliers, we need to drive innovation in actual packaging. So how do we reduce the amount of plastic in bottles? How do we reduce it in clamshell containers? So we're building technical resources, trying to create more opportunities for recycled feedstock to come back into the production chain so that we can reduce that overall impact in packaging.
You should come talk to us. We've been doing a lot of work in that area. Packaging at Dell, it's area I'm very, very interested in. I lead the packaging team. We did a study some years ago. How many times do you touch packaging during the course of a day? And we did half a day. Anybody care to guess what we found? How many times you touch it? Number was 37 between time you wake up, and that's just lunchtime, right? People stop counting afterwards. And there's 7.5 billion people on the planet and growing, most of whom all touch packaging multiple times a day. It is a turbocharged issue, hence your question. And so at Dell, we've been really looking at ways to how do we eliminate plastic. We've led industry breakthroughs with using fiber, starting with bamboo and then recycled paper and pulps. So if you buy a Dell notebook or other lightweight product, it will be packaged in molded pulp, and you can recycle that. So we don't want things going to landfills. You know, part of our motivating idea here is, you know, we talked about journeys earlier. It used to be, what I learned in the Boy Scouts was, you know, do less harm. Then moved to do no harm. Now it's, hey, leave things better than you found them, which is actually, I think, tremendous progress that we have this mindset. And so that's what we're trying to do, make our boxes smaller, have more recyclable material. It's even looking at things like tape. Our new Latitude notebooks, which just launched, all use paper tape. The people in the factory weren't happy about that because it's like, oh man, we got to change all these processes. It's like, yeah, right. So you talk about unintended consequences. You find you have all these stakeholders, and how do you address them through the supply chain? Plastic bags. People come to me all the time, say, Oliver, let's get rid of plastic bags. We don't like them. It's like, yeah, I don't like them either. But here's the problem. They were so cheap that became their own ecosystem, which is kind of ironic because we're trying to fix the ecosystem. And when you look at a plastic bag, and Jay, I'd love to talk to you about this, maybe there's collaboration here, but things like labels go on plastic bags so they can scan for inventory. Don't want to put it on the product, etc. It saves the surface finishes, for example, and it prevents things like dusting. So my point is, there's lots of stakeholders which have to be addressed in things like packaging. I think people are motivated, and in 10 years, I think you'll see tremendous progress on this. So I may have gone a little long in for that.
No,
I
that's good.
apologize.
I think we went over. I might have all of you, if you have questions for our panelists, kind of chase them down afterwards, and I'll have sort of Angela, since I didn't get to ask one last question, wrap it up for us. Yeah, if you could close it out for all of us. You know, much of NRDC's work is basically persuading decision makers and the people at the table. And given the state of the political will right now, as you talked about national action or inaction and where our planet is going right now, what's your message for policymakers, industry executives, and those who have, you know, the power to make systemic change?
Sure.
No pressure.
That's an easy one, of course. Well, you know, coming into this conversation, we were told, you know, the room is, you know, community leaders, elected leaders, and the like. And I think I would say first and foremost that despite what's going on here in Washington and the inaction or, you know, opportunity, a lot of this work is at the state and local level. A lot of funding has already been deployed. What is happening is that decisions need to be made about where it's going to be invested. And that really rests with the state electeds here. You know, I always, you know, remind others when we're having this conversation, you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu type thing. And this is an opportunity for legislators, leaders of color, to really be in that conversation about how these funds are going to be directed in communities. That is a message that I think is like, don't, you know, while we continue to push for a reconciliation bill, please do not wait until that happens before you start taking action in your communities. I would say for industry leaders, you know, I'm so grateful for you all representing your companies today and the work that you're doing. The steps that you're taking are so important. But also recognize that unfortunately in your associations, you have fossil fuel industries there that are adamant about not wanting to change. And so I would say to you, use your power and your leverage to please push them and say, we cannot sustain this anymore. And, you know, no one is ever happy to see, you know, jobs go away or anything like that. But the fossil fuel industry is getting smaller. Clean energy jobs are the ones that are growing. And so that's where we really need to be putting a lot more emphasis into clean energy jobs there. Oops. Okay. Is that my time? And I guess, well, yeah, I mean, I would end with that. Is that there's action that we can take. And that is not wholly dependent on the federal government doing things, as you mentioned before. While you wait, you know, we're trying to get our own act together, but I think many already know that there's action that can be taken at the local level right now, in adaptation and mitigation and all sorts of things.
Thank you so much. And everyone, thank you again for being here and being our audience. This is such a good job. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to chase us down in the hallways. Thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.